If my voice holds up through this, Kaz, it'd be great. But we are really pleased to have Dr. Caroline Keep back on with us, who is a, whoop, whoop. If you don't know Kaz, you need to know Kaz, physics teacher, director of Spark, Makerspace, leader, founder, leader, organizer, teacher of the year. Well, I think the big thing that we want to talk about is you just got your PhD in AI with a focus on EdTech. And there's lots of other things, global judge things. But the first thing I want to ask you, because it was at the start of your thesis, was you talk about being an underdog. And certainly when you come to our school, you're here as an inspiration to the kids, as opposed to a PhD candidate, as you were last time you came, because you're overdue a visit. But how important was it to you to achieve what amazing stuff you've written, what you've achieved as an underdog?
I think I put, my thesis will come out so everybody will be able to read it. If you two have had, somewhat early access, I think it was really important for me to write that slight bit at the beginning about, that this work was dedicated to the underdog. I deliberately kept in my special educational needs front page. So I've deliberately kept it in. Normally, when you do your PhD, you have, if you've got accommodations, because I'm autistic, ADHD, and dyslexic, aren't I? So normally you have like a page that says that this work is, the work of a student with special educational needs. And it's a front page that then later on they take out. But I chose to I'm choosing to keep mine in. And also to just highlight to everybody in that first page that some educational journeys are not nice and linear and straightforward. Some of them are much longer. Some of them aren't necessarily easy starts. Some of them are very difficult throughout. My parents were very much told when I was younger that I wouldn't amount to much, is what they said. There'd be not much she could do.
Told by who?
By teachers and educational professionals and social workers. So it was very clear early on that I would not educationally be there. I struggled during my GCSEs. I was in court, over child abuse cases that I'm quite open about when I was 14 through 16. I failed a chunk of them. I did a few of them because they straddled a court case. I couldn't finish my A-levels, and my dedication this week I put out to the Prince's Trust. What was the Prince's Trust? What's now the King's Trust? And they took me in at a time when I was in a really bad way, and did workplace learning with me and basically did the Prince's Trust program, what it was at the time. And I worked with lots of other young people who were very much like me. And then I took a job, and then slowly but surely I've ended up here. But I didn't come from academic backgrounds. This was not it wasn't for me. Apparently.
It feels like the thesis is amazing, but it feels like what you're talking about and what you've achieved needs to be put into something as well that can be shared with a lot more children.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, a few people have said that, during my Viva, my examiners were very like, you'll have to write a book. And it was, I've been kind of begrudgingly avoiding writing any kind of book because I feel like maybe it seems like a big task to do after I've just done this.
Yeah, I get
but
that.
I think it's a different sort of relationship. I think sometimes, I was always, for me, in my world, I was always a kind of a decade behind everybody. Everybody else kind of like got all the bits in place and managed to do this. I had to redo my GCSEs before I became a teacher, even though I'd done a degree, because I didn't actually have like English and maths GCSEs and I needed to do them. I had to kind of catch up to everybody. So I'm always kind of I feel like now I've kind of got to the stage where I've caught up to everybody. But that's I think sometimes you're a bit behind.
I think you're way ahead of most people now.
Well, this is the thing. When we do catch up, there's there's not necessarily, you shouldn't really think of kids in kind of limits. When they do get it, it's fine. Sometimes we just take a little longer to get it. You know what I mean? Now, if you'd asked me when I was 14, being able to sit my own GCSE, maths, I'm struggling with it. And then basically not being able to do it at all. I completely failed my GCSEs maths. That later on, I'd be writing and designing, artificial intelligence maths. I would be
I'm
like,
trying to
oh my
read your
God,
maths.
it's not even going to do it. You know what I mean? That's never going to happen. It
Listening to
does.
that, and then I read your maths in your thesis and the fuzzy, and I think, I don't understand what you're talking about. So your maths has gone from not getting a GCSE,
Yeah.
which is I don't know, don't get me started on you have to have a GCSE, to writing maths that most people won't understand.
Yeah. And I think that in itself is, it feels strange sometimes.
It's amazing.
Yeah, because I think most of us feel like, so the shadow of our childhood person is always kind of with us sometimes. You always think about it, especially when you talk about young people and teaching, you remember who you were as a young person, and I was not in the best place as a young person. I was one of the kids that people would be like, "What have you heard about? I'm so sorry." Lots of people apologized to my mother during that period.
Don't you think your research is reliving a little bit? This is me being a bit tenuous, but Matt just alluded to it there. There's a fair bit of work you did in your research around fuzzy logic, and rather than looking at things in the very linear sense, looking at that kind of degrees of change. Isn't that the whole problem with children? We look at them in the linear sense rather than applying fuzzy logic to the values we attribute to people. Now, maybe I've kind of gone 360 there, but it was kind of a strong part of the mathematical side of what you were looking at.
Yes. The strong maths part of fuzzy logic is that there's not a binary set system. The most complicated decisions that we have are not, this or that.
Degrees of separation.
Really degrees of separation. And I think for me, that was why I chose fuzzy logic to do the model on, because I realized that our education system, our kids, the decisions we make are not always clear cut. And that's kind of the way that you can model that out. It's just a very different way of modeling, so that it's not one that you do it where you kind of go, oh, this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. It is those degrees of difference between them and what the consensus is.
I think that's brilliant what you're saying there, Alex. I just remember after COVID, and there was this focus on the phrase catch up. And we were like, catch up to what? It's catch up to these arbitrary targets that somebody's set. And actually, if we'd had a more of fuzzy logic approach to it, catch up to things that meet strengths, meet needs. Yeah.
Tell a child you need to catch up. Tell a child you're behind, and you've already set a certain expectation, don't you? In a negative connotation. Kaz is somebody that you can kind of unpick and think on a bigger picture about some of these things. But I think we're learning, some of our conversations, previous episodes, Matt, where we're saying with the advent of a digital AI world, the things we value most in the workplace now are people's soft skills. We're kind of saying we're all a bit, I know we can say on the scale, but we're all a bit fuzzy and we're all a bit on that line. And actually what we're saying is that the outliers, the bits that are a bit different, are actually the human bits that are more attractive now, given we've got such a linear digital world that we're existing in. Whilst that isn't the depth of Kaz's research, I kind of think you can always look at these things and say, you know what, why don't we take our thinking process and apply that same kind of assessment to some of the real challenges we're facing in a broader societal sense?
I just feel with Kaz's research, it's amazing on its own as a thesis, as a PhD, and what you've done it is amazing. But you've got the human aspect, which is equally, if not more so, impressive and important to get out there as well. Well, yeah, we hate to talk about your thesis, so sorry.
I think drives based on values as the truth. It's the Digital Readiness Index valuation for education, is the name of my thesis. And it's a framework and a tool for the values that educators have about what they want in the digital systems within schools. And I think that's, even though there's lots of technical detail in it and there's lots of technical backing behind it, what it really, in my opinion, comes down to is what are the values that we consistently keep coming back to within certain, areas. So like we all want like authentic assessment, right? Everybody wanted authentic assessment. Everybody had big concerns. I called it like, that the difficulties with assessment not being authentic and being drilled down into this multiple choice guess world because it was automated easily was a big one. We weren't assessing well enough with the tech. What we were doing was we were letting the tech lead how we assess. But there's bigger questions in there where we all need to figure out and define what do we mean by authentic assessments. And I do say that, so we need to have these kind of definitions, and you see it over and over again in my thesis. Things like,
are you talking formative, summative, or just the broader sense of how we look at
broader
things?
sense of assessment? There is detail in there, and formative and summative changes that they wanted. But the overwhelming number one hit one was we wanted authentic assessments, and we were concerned we were not getting them attack. So there's kind of like the same principles kind of repeated over and over again. So when you get into things like digital safety, responsibility is the number one.
So it kind of feels you've encompassed a lot of the things that, research around pedagogy-informed EdTech, that kind of focus, which is much about behavioral choices. But then Drive framework kind of takes the thinking a bit further beyond that in terms of digital and what we're trying to achieve and that broader sense. Is that a fair synopsis?
Yeah. It's really, I ask us to rethink how we treat digital and teach it as, treat it as more a cultural, societal, ethical responsibility across several communities, not even just the teaching communities, parental, political. It's a social, social technological framework more so.
So if I dropped you off on a plane in America right now, and the answer was, well, digital shouldn't have a place in a classroom, what would you say?
I think I'm not pro-tech and I'm not anti-tech. I'm pro-pedagogy. So it's kind of like what works. If it works and it works for us, there were many occasions where many things did work. So one of the big wins was accessibility and inclusion. Voice notes, voice dictation, captions, all of that was transformational in teaching. It's one of the biggest levers we can pull. But then you've got a whole bunch of other stuff where we're like, obviously this isn't working. I say things like the illusions of control for how we filter, that we're not teaching the kind of critical skills to use tech. That the phone bans were incredibly popular because that dealt with some of the big issues that we have. And I could understand how people use that. But on the same hand, people were saying that it was very difficult to then teach the kind of critical skills that they needed to. So there's good and bad in tech. It's really down to how we use tech. And if we apply...
Everybody we talk to, Kaz, says we kind of get there's good and bad, and half the time it's how you apply it and when it's the right time to apply and all the rest, which then questions how do we still seem to end up internationally debating some of the foundational things where there's already pretty good research that put the right person in the right room at the right time and measure the best lessons that are innovative with tech and the ones that need no tech whatsoever, and celebrate them just as much.
I think I think the reason I designed it the way I did is that so teachers could literally take more control of this debate and basically start judging tech to see if it was educationally ready for them. So it asks a lot of questions. There's nearly about 14 assessments where it's done on paper, the paper-based version of the model. And it's literally for you to keep and then for you to score and then for you to compare. And I kept it offline for various reasons. So I didn't want you all comparing each other to each other. But it asks very detailed questions really about policies, practices, whether the tech in question that you're thinking of adopting does this. But it also lets you assess your entire school system to see where the levers are worth pulling. Because I think sometimes when we talk about technology, we hear all of this and then it becomes very difficult to implement any of it because it feels so as if everything is equally important and everything should be done. We need to get our infrastructure right. We need to get our policies right. We need to get our practices right. But nobody had really looked and systematically mapped out schools enough to be able to say, right, well, where do we start? This tells you where your weak spots are and where your strongest points are. And then it lets you kind of go, okay, so assessment's something we really need to look at, or actual digital safety is one that we really need to look at, or our ethical policies are the big ones to look at. So that way you can kind of gauge it and get control a bit over it. And then you can retest it in the model and see whether you kind of like it'll predict some improvements before you go and buy any tech. So this is kind of pre-spending.
Feels like there's more longevity to a framework that empowers people to ask the questions themselves than trying to give people the answers and say, this is what you should do, because there's too much nuance in the system to allow for that.
Yeah, I think for mine, it's a decision-making tool. It's evaluation. It's to help you make decisions about the technology implemented in your school. It's not necessarily to, here's exactly what you should and shouldn't do, or, it's much more holistic than that. So you kind of go through the system, you go through and put in your numbers for what you think is in your school, the same as all our experts did. And then it generates a report based on our expert 50 cohort and our 250 survey teachers. That's the average within the UK. And then it says where you are in comparison, what is the best practices that had gone on, what kind of areas you might want to look at. And then what you do is you do a very detailed survey afterwards that you download with your report, that then you get together with a group of your experts or your digital lead or your head teachers, whoever you want, and you go through it slowly by slowly to identify the areas where actually you think that maybe you could find the improvements there. And compare it to your model report, because that paper-based report is actually, and maybe not many people realize it, it's what's called an adversarial comparison. So it basically adversarially paper-based challenges the model, so that it's never a solo decision. And then you have those discussions and then you decide, right, these are the areas, that you could look at. And this is the score that we got in this area. These are the things that we want to change. Yeah. And 3 schools did that in the trial, and all of them were pretty pleased with it. I think my dashboard still needs a little work. So I'm working on that, guys, because even though this was the first stage of the dashboard, because that's what you do in a PhD is proof of full concept. So it's not my full nice slick dashboard. So I'm probably going to neaten that up before the final comes out so that everybody can have access to it. But I'm looking to just put that out there and make that free.
We all know when that comes out, you'll have it in 3D, 4D, 5D, and with a direct neural connection.
Do you know what? Actually, lots of my the schools, what they actually wanted was can we have it on PowerPoint so we can have discussions across school about it? So actually, I've done kind of a lot of teacher things with it. So that was fine.
Was there anything ever that came out from the data, if you like, that went against your instinct and you thought, oh, that's not right?
Yeah. Several things went against my instincts. So one of them was private schools didn't rate tech better than public schools. So I really thought, I was on that train. I really thought public schools, private schools, have got so much more money. They're going to have much better experience than us. But no, statistically, there was no different experience from a private school than there was from public school. So
kind of reassuring, isn't it? In a way,
kind of
unexpected. I'm with you.
Yeah, it was a bit kind of okay. Didn't expect that. I thought that would be different. No. One of the other ones was in the first round of you do a very big literature search. I choose to do a very massive one called a bibliometric one.
Yeah.
And I had a very, very detailed look at all of the kind of digital readiness kind of stuff that was out there, everything that we'd done in kind of EdTech frameworks that had been out there in Industry 4, Education 4.0. And I expected to find like teacher-centric stuff. Like, because we're talking about educational technology. So I thought, oh, I'm going to find Industry 4 will be industry. But Education 4.0, that'll look like schools. But then when I did look into it, it didn't look like schools at all. So I had to redesign a new category, which is like Teacher 4.0, which was specifically school-based research that was specifically for secondary, primary, FE schools, instead of it being university-based. A lot of the conversation in the literature was higher ed, talking about what might be in schools. So there's not enough school-based research on educational tech. There's a lot of drop-in from a university, go into one single class, run one single tech with 50 for, 8 weeks, very detailed, and then say that that's great. It's very, there's random withdrawal trials. They're very, very narrow, and it can be very limited. I wanted to do something that was very broad ranging. So when I looked at that, I realized that no, I was going to need to go to different literature. So actually, I turned to the teacher community more than anything. I did what's called a grey literature search. I went back, I went through BERA, I went through all of the kind of chart school for, chart school for educators. I went through I asked people what kind of research, what papers they were reading, who were they listening to. And I got all of the kind of grey literature, some white papers, some books, and I assessed that instead to see what teachers' world looked like. And it had very, very different picture. It was much more student focused, whilst, higher ed had a completely different set of priorities. So there's a danger in kind of how we frame it. I think I almost wanted to call it like the Babelfish moment, really. I think because like the industry was talking about was one way, and then universities and research was talking about as another way, but then school teachers were talking about something completely different. So it's this kind of mismatch between the language and the thing. So right at the beginning of my research, I had to actually write like a whole page or two for teachers, engineers, and academics, trying to relate to them the importance of each of the sections, because they generally don't read that. So it was very interesting to do, but yeah, it's been interesting to see. But they're the kind of two that really kind of like took me back. I was like, and I think I found the SEND chapter the hardest to write, being SEND myself, because that was just really just gut wrenching that we were investing a lot in this technology, but number one was limited training and support. So we were investing in the technology to do it, hoping for better outcomes. But because we had such limited understanding and training, it was creating this completely, what I call the accessibility paradox. The tools were overwhelming. We wouldn't have enough training. We wouldn't have enough support. And eventually the tool would just end up creating more barriers for students. So that I found pretty difficult.
When did you start this, Cass? That will be 2020 what?
2021.
So can I ask a really simple question? I mean, it's probably very rare that it actually happens, but I know of some educators that are now creating their own EdTech using AI. So how does your drive model and your work align with the change in that? It's still very niche, I think, in the people, instead of buying EdTech, are creating their own.
I think there's a very big difference between creating your own EdTech and academically doing a PhD. For a start, you don't defend it. Do you know what I mean? I defended mine with Professor Tom Crick, who's, the chief scientific advisor to the government, and Dr. Jules at the University of Lancaster, who's an engineer. So my research is actually in engineering and computing. It's not an EdD. It's an engineering and computing qualification. Okay. So that makes mine slightly different. I think I'm all pro educators doing the work to create tools for us. I think they're in a better position to do so. And I think people do need to do more of that. But I think mine was designed to try and give us more ownership over this tech cycle that we're in. And also try and give us more ownership about what tech we were adopting, why we were adopting it, and what kind of questions as educators we wanted to answer in the most empirical way that I could. So mine's quite defensible.
But yours is quite, there's almost an argument that a lot of software in EdTech is almost not obsolete, but after 3 or 4 years is not being used as effectively as when it was initially bought.
Yeah, and that's one of the key things from the model. Most EdTech has a shelf life of about 3 years. In every single scenario, the peak kind of tails off when you get learning outcomes and workload. So you've got maybe 3 years of really good used tech. But that assumes if you are, just generally how we're using it now. If you had better implemented CPD, better implemented ethical policies, better training with it, if you brought the kind of things we're used to at schools, the kind of more socially policy type things with you, then you got a little longer out of that tech. But most tech needed a complete refresh or rethink within a 3-year period.
And is that because of the tech or because of the usage or both?
It's a bit of both. It's because of the tech itself. Things get updated, things get changed. People get, fair with how they use it. Also because everybody will know things like laptops. We've seen this, one of the big ones that was in there was all about the COVID replacements for laptops was a massive issue. We'd spent hundreds of millions on them. And now there wasn't a replacement system for them was in there. Updates, that you've got to have a whole life cycle for the tech itself. So really it's about a 3-year period you should be reviewing. I mean, personally, I recommended drivers design to be done yearly. So you yearly reflect on your technology and know within a year, is that performing? Is it doing what we want it to do? If it's not doing what we want it to do, is there other alternatives that we could use? What types of things? That's what you should be asking.
It's just really interesting because we've just had Becky Bowler on, who's enlightened me, and I don't know if I was as aware as well, but they have this in place for their hardware. They have, what do they call it? I can't remember now. A system where it's refreshed every few years, and they have funds
put part
for
of
this.
the allocation straight into it. Yeah. Renewal fund.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all of them now, I'd like everybody to move to that. Like 3-year refresh programs or having a look at them and seeing them. But if you use a Drive framework, it's in there. So you'll be doing it every year, looking to see what works and what's not. A lot of the time there was a big issue of lots of people spending a lot of money on kind of products that were licensed and, you had license to use it with young children and, it was over a year period, especially online products that would just roll over and that they, quite often we accumulate them.
Yeah.
And I called it in mine like a tech saturation effect. If you were a school that was high tech and really high performing in tech, then you were served better to be very critical about tech. Because it basically downgraded it to the specific tech that would really benefit you. So, that's an optimism, pessimism type categorization when you look at it. But if you were a school that was very anti-tech, it served you to be a little bit optimistic about tech. But if you were in the average school, it still served you to kind of look at tech slightly critically. So that the more tech you adopt, the more it benefits you to be more critical in your adoption of tech.
There's an interesting parallel here, and I kind of use my words carefully. I mean, on one hand, 35 years making EdTech, I'm a big fan of the Clayton Christensen model, where there's a lot of digital disruption. You kind of you start with a product that does the minimum requirement for a school, and every year you iterate based on feedback and competition and technology, and you reach critical mass where it just does more than is ever needed, and you have to reset and start again. I'd also argue if you build in being platform agnostic and data agnostic and those things, actually the sustainability of a lifespan is much longer as long as you keep refreshing your digital approach to how do you use it. I mean, that would argue that's the Clayton Christensen type model, and there's others apply. But in business, that's kind of a normal thing. You wouldn't say we have tools for production, process, and engineering. We installed them 10 years ago and we haven't reviewed them. Every year we'd be saying, is there a better way? Is there something we can do differently? And I think in education, we're always tied up with, I'd like to think about a better way, but I want evidence informed, and no one's done it yet. So how do I find the bedfellow of innovation and evidence informed at the same time?
I
I
think
think it's the same in personal lives as well. Nobody keeps a mobile phone after 2 or 3 years. You always go back and you get a new one, don't you? Because you want the
Yeah.
new tech.
But if I
Yeah,
tell you you can have a
education.
new car tomorrow, and I tell you it's called the whoop-de-doo Kingsley, you'll also say, I'm not sure if I want to buy something that no one else is using, and I haven't got any
Whoop-de-doo.
reassurance about its reliability.
Yeah.
And so there's also this element of when somebody says, I want to try using technology in a different way, we look outside and say, who else is doing that? Nobody. I don't want to be the first. So there's also this kind of tension.
So also built into the DRIVE framework is an expectation of sharing best practice or also an expectation of testing tech, classroom testing tech, and basically having these small pit studies of a technology before adoption. So, and asking companies to give you that. And, the hope is in that, in some respects, in the pressure of doing that, more companies will adopt it because they'll be like, well, you kind of don't pass the DRIVE framework with us. So this company does. So we're going to go with this company. So that more companies that go, yeah, actually, we'd love you to, it costs this much to do a test run, and we're going to do a test run with it and then publicly come out and talk about that test run.
Kaz, can I ask you, I'm conscious of time, but we tend to use EdTech as an umbrella term. And I have to confess, it frustrates me because half the tech in a school is not in the classroom. It's not the same consideration. And at the same time, we also tend to say, oh, you've got a Microsoft Surface, that's EdTech. And it's like, well, it really isn't. It's a consumer device that's being used in an education setting. How do you, within your framework, kind of keep a bit of sanity to what is EdTech?
I'm using the word EdTech very generally here. In the thesis, it very much specifies many different areas that EdTech can happen in, and many areas that teachers haven't thought about when they were mapping it out. Everything from buildings and security into cybersecurity into online safety. So each one of them has kind of a node. You think of like a giant mind map that then has a whole bunch of very specific data behind, so that basically you can model that out. But most of the kind of gains that we get is not actually classroom tech. So, I mean, accessibility and inclusion tech for the classroom, yes, go and do that. But actually, there's a lot of gains that were outside of the classroom. But I didn't model out just the classroom. What I modeled out was the whole system, which had been really the first time a full model had ever been done.
We expect nothing less of you, Kaz, to be clear.
That in itself tells us a lot about where the pull and push is within systems, and also what areas need to be thought about together. So, you can't just think about assessment on its own. You have to think about it alongside all of the tech for inclusion. You have to think about it alongside all of the tech for buildings, actually. So there's various bits that you need to think, this is a cluster of tech that we need to think about together. And what it does is it specifies out where those clusters are. And in the model, you get like a little printout that actually says, like, here's the most negative tech that's impacting your system, that's slowing things down. And here's your positive tech, positive eigenvalues, if you want to get specific, that are kind of in the model driving the system. So that's good. So the tech itself is very wide ranging. I think I'd like us to have much more kind of admin support tech, building, things like IoT tech for kind of like, smart classrooms, for controlling lighting, systems.
Temperature, energy,
that kind of tech actually would be much more beneficial. So, and a lot of the tech that was classroom tech was very much, if it's specific to the curricula and if it's specific to, the tech that's being used, say in geography and GIS, it's very specific tech when it's in a classroom that's working, so, that's the kind of key bit with that. It's not just general tech, and I think we probably need to rethink how we look at it and what kind of ways that we adopt tech in the future.
Love that. Matt, do you want to wrap up questions?
So temperature was interesting because last summer we had 35 degrees in the classroom. And how on earth you can expect anyone to teach or learn in that sort of temperature is beyond me.
Yeah.
Whatever tech you've got, unless it's air conditioning.
Yeah. I mean, I make the point in the thesis that every single technological adoption has got to be weighed against a practical adoption that we could do just generally. So, and I think the one that I compare is a very sophisticated online behavior tracking in comparison to just upgrading your corridor systems in your bathrooms. So, everything has got to be weighed against those kind of practical things that we do every day. So, it's not enough for us to just keep going. Well, we spent an absolute huge amount of money, and some of the more frightening parts of the thesis were in kind of the EdTech questions and the policy questions. The EdTech questions did really, EdTech's influence on education did really frighten me writing them. There was a lot of very questionable things going on in there.
Tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, tail wagging the dog indeed.
Yeah.
But also many educators feeling deeply uncomfortable with the positions they were being put in, having to, being given tech that was quite cheap and then having to promote it, having to sell it, having to go to places and spend a lot of money, on technology and then it not working, not having anywhere to talk about that. It was very uncomfortable. But then on the same hand, in the policy sections, there was a lot about really the policy being very much in crisis. But I think not for the way that we normally think about it. I think teachers, as much as I love teachers, I think sometimes they have the way that we go, the policy's just not good enough. But actually, there were policymakers in my expert groups. There were people who had influence on policy. One of the quotes was, "There's the DFEs are few people in office. They don't stand a chance against big tech." And that's the truth. So a lot of these policymakers were coming under the same sort of pressure that teachers were, being, influenced and pressured by big tech. Many of them were getting 5 to 6 emails a day on tech. So we've got to really evaluate and strengthen kind of our relationships in this and really have less pressure on teachers for adoption and more relationships with companies. Because there were many examples where companies had very good working relationships with schools that had worked really well. But a lot of that kind of pressure was really getting to people. So
I think that's quite an important part of the next question. Where do you see technology rather than tech and AI heading in schools over the next few years? What should we be worried about more than we already are? And how will drive help with this?
I think we've got to start framing technology as not just a technological decision. It is a social, political, and cultural decision to use tech. And we've got to start treating it like that. So if you are going to adopt AI in a system in a school, then you might want to consider that there are many parents and students who will not like the fact you've adopted it. That it has ethical concerns in there, that you're going to need to give them an opt-out system. It cannot be blanketed across. It's going to have bias. I still have concerns about just blanket generative AI in systems. I think we deserve school-specific systems. That's what I think on that one. If you're going to use it, make it school-specific, and then that way we can safeguard. Because whilst we don't control these things,
it's been discussed today, Kaz, actually. I mean, those listening won't know what today is, but that's probably safest bet to not say what today is. But on this date, we're talking about the risk of generative AI, and we have the US government politically telling Anthropic that their latest model has to be withdrawn from anybody who's not a US resident. So outside the country, for what they say is competitive and security reasons, they don't want Anthropic's latest model to be accessible. Now, there's a little bit of Anthropic have told the government in America they can't use their AI for military purposes, so they don't like them and they're causing issues. But we have seen this, build all your foundations on big tech, and I prefer the big tech, ed tech kind of separation there. There are vulnerabilities in the same way as we're seeing European countries going back to open source for some of their platforms.
Yeah.
But the idea of sovereign AI, sovereign data sets that are nationally right context, I'm with you. There's a whole heap of sense around.
I think, I read that on Linux now being adopted by major countries, and I've been part of the open source community for a long time. So, I knew a lot of the risks of that, way before I wrote the thesis. I do think there is a sovereignty aspect to this, because if we have kind of sovereignty of the AIs or the kind of technology that we're using, then we have control about what's going to be set, what's in there, and our responsibilities in it. I don't see, I got asked this question. I don't see AI is inherently bad, but I do write a section right at the front that is but let's, take our time a bit here and lower our expectations, because
It's been very quick, hasn't it?
it has been
2 years
massively
from
quick.
everywhere.
And I think we haven't really grappled with a lot of the sovereignty, security, data issues, many issues that are in there that we will need to grapple with in the future. I likened it actually during my Viva to the following. The NHS has adopted certain parts of AI in the use, and they've adopted it for things like sending out appointment letters or, admin-based stuff. And the NHS's pure purpose is to save lives. So they have massive focus on, say, like heart attacks, making sure that people get surgery and fast and making sure it works. What they didn't do in their main focus is the first thing they got adopted when they decided to start using artificial intelligence is let's adopt it for, doing surgery. It seemed ridiculous, but I think sometimes our main focus is to teach kids to learn. And it seems we've gone, let's adopt it for learning first. I think maybe adopting it for things like, more structured admin might have been a better goal.
Data analysis, administration, lots of yeah, absolutely.
Just to start with, until we had any, confidence and we could see some of the pitfalls for it. I think there's plenty of AIs out there. I'm not saying that they're not useful, and I'm certainly not an anti-AI. My framework is built on a very different type of AI. But I do think we do need to have control. Mine's what's called like a clear box AI. So you have black box like generative AIs where you can't see them, you don't know what you're doing. Fuzzy cognitive maps are based on, the FCMs are based on really clear box AI. So basically you can see every single decision in them, and you can see exactly where all the data from every single decision came from. So you can go into it and trace it through and go through and go, okay, it's this specific set of data that decision's come from. And that makes them much more justifiable when you start using them in schools for any purpose. Now, mine's intent on trying to help teachers become more informed in decision making for themselves. But, you could use similar systems to be able to have more kind of better data decisions. But it's not going to give you kind of black and white answers, Mike. Because that, I think, is somewhat problematic in our kind of settings to be very definite.
I always knew we could talk to you for hours, Kaz. I'm very mindful we're at 45 minutes and we've got another interview coming up. Matt, do you want to dive in with a closer, and then we'll book Kaz for series 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in advance?
Well, maybe what you might want to do is maybe theme it, Al, next time. So maybe I'll talk with Matt and you about kind of like a theme, because there's so many in there that it's quite vast.
This is more about thinking about
your thesis, drive. But I suppose the final question: how, when, and where, and how can we help with this? Will education get access to Drive?
It's probably going to be in the next couple of months. I'm hoping to round up the thesis, make sure that it's all done, dusted, write any papers that I need to. The first thing I'll do is probably just launch a very slicker version of the website itself with just the thing on it, and then kind of put the papers out around it. So I'm hoping over the next 6 to 12 months. I know that sounds like a slow process. I'm really sorry, guys. It is a little slow. You'll be able to read what's in it. And the paper-based version is at the back of the thesis. So you can use the paper-based version first. It's, the problem with academia is that it is quite a laborious process to justify things really robustly. And because I wanted to make this as robust as physically possible, you have to kind of go through the process of doing it. But yeah, I'm considering writing a book with a guide at the back so that everybody can have it in teacher English instead of, you know, this big laborious kind of like thing that Matt's struggling to kind
You need that, yeah.
of. So I promise I'll write something that's more like, here's it in the common language. I struggle to write in that too. You know, probably in the next 6 to 12 months, depending on whether I get it, you know, out or get it writing sooner. But I'm writing as fast as I can. So, you know, we'll see how we go. But it should be, it should be good. It should be available. It's not anything that will probably change because it's based on education's values, education's consensus, education's own kind of internal set of positions that were most common among all the educators who took part. So it's not quite the same as like, oh, you need to get this, you need to get this. It's not going to be about that.
So it's watch that space, and then we all need to help you get it out there to everyone.
Yes,
Really.
definitely.
Yeah.
So when I get over the kind of writing stage, yes, you know what I mean. But it's nice for it to be academically, you know, validated on that front. It's been through a very rigorous process.
Thank you, Kaz.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. And officially, well, you know what Matt and I think. You are a star, Kaz. And I think you continue to
see you next week.
Give back to the community.
Well, you will. If you're at Matt's thing, you will see me next week. I'll be pottering on up there. It's my first outing since actually getting done. So I'm looking forward to it. So I should be a more relaxed,
definitely
busier Caroline. Yeah.
Brilliant. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mrs. Take care.